For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about a guy named Abraham, who's a big deal to our faith. In fact, he's known as the father of the Christian faith, the guy who followed God into uncharted territory and paved the way for the rest of us. And even though Abraham followed God's leading, he didn't always get it right. But God used him in spite of the messes he made along the way.
As we wrap up this series, we are going to look at a time when God asked Abraham to take a step that seems crazy. In fact, at first glance, it seemed cruel, harsh, and even wrong. As we read what happened, some of us might even question the way we view who God really is.
But before your view of God can change, for better or for worse, you have to start by answering this question. How do you view God? And whether you've been hanging around the church since goldfish crackers were the highlight of your week, or this whole church thing is brand new to you, you have a view of God. We all do.
So what comes to mind when you think about God? Of course, there are obvious church answers: loving, compassionate, kind, forgiving. Even though these descriptions might seem a little predictable, they're right. God is all of those things and more.
But if we're being honest, we'd all probably say most of us don't always view God that way. On the days when our friends are slipping away from us, on the day of school pictures when we wake up with a massive zit on our forehead, when we are not sure if our parents will even have enough money to pay for those zit-covered photos, when there's sickness, pain, suffering, and loss, how do we view God then?
I think it's usually something like this. A school principal. When you think of God, you picture him standing with his arms crossed, glasses on, just waiting for you to mess up so he can send you to detention.
An old man in a rocking chair. When you picture God, you see him slowly rocking back and forth, his eyes glazed over, nearly asleep. He's mostly unaware of our presence and definitely not paying attention to what's going on in our lives.
Downer. When you think of God, you think of the exact opposite of fun. He's just some being who exists to drain the fun and excitement out of life. If you can think of something fun to do, it's almost a guarantee that God doesn't want you to do it.
A vending machine. When you interact with God, he's like a machine where you see something you want and put in what you need to get it. And then once you get it, you walk away until you want something else.
Can you identify with any of those descriptions? I know that I can. But here's the thing about all of those and similar views of God. They're missing the mark. When we see God in those ways, we're missing out on so much of who he really is. When we let our circumstances guide how we see God, we're only seeing part of the picture.
In order to truly trust God to lead us into uncharted territory, we have to start viewing him through the right lens. We have to believe that at the end of the day, no matter what, God is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. Easier said than done, right?
Well, today, we're going to read about how Abraham had to do just that. Back in Abraham's time, people had a very limited view of God. In fact, they didn't really believe in God, but instead in many different gods. And they probably would have described these gods as picky, angry, harsh, and demanding. They definitely wouldn't have said that their gods were loving.
At this point in Abraham's journey, he was just starting to see God as a caring, loving, and kind God. Abraham took the first step to follow God, and even when he messed up along the way, God still proved himself faithful and forgiving.
Now, Abraham and his wife Sarah had settled down together with their son Isaac. As you might remember, Abraham and Sarah wanted a child very badly. It took them a long time to finally have Isaac. So I think it's safe to say that they loved him very much.
That's what makes this next part of the story so crazy. God said to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." I'm sorry, what now? Did we read that right? God wants Abraham to take Isaac, the son who was the direct result of God's promise to him, and kill him?
As upset as Abraham would have been at the thought of this, he probably wasn't as shocked as we are right now. The concept of child sacrifice was unfortunately pretty normal in that day. And in Abraham's culture, if a God provided you with something like a child, they also had the right to take it back. Pretty crazy, right?
So even though Abraham was probably devastated by the thought of what God was asking him to do, he still set out the next morning to do it. He still went into uncharted territory.
Scripture tells us that as Abraham and Isaac approached the place where the sacrifice was supposed to happen, Isaac spoke up and questioned where the lamb was for the offering. And his dad's response? Simply that God would provide what was needed for the sacrifice.
Isaac probably shrugged off his dad's explanation and didn't really think about it again. That is until Abraham took out the rope, tied it around his son, and laid him on top of the wood. Can you even imagine that? The story goes on. Then he, Abraham, reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son.
This is it, the terrible, horrible, unbelievable moment we've been waiting for. Abraham was about to take his son's life. Why? Because the God who was leading him into uncharted territory was asking him to do it. And maybe, just maybe, the God Abraham started to believe loved him wasn't so loving and kind after all.
In that dramatic, emotional moment, God called out to Abraham. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And guess what? Just then, Abraham noticed a ram caught in the bushes and sacrificed that instead of his son.
You can almost feel the sigh of relief. In the last moment, God provided for Abraham everything he needed to finish the job and save his son. And it demonstrated that God really was who he says he was. Loving, kind, merciful, compassionate. In a time full of cruel and unforgiving gods, God showed Abraham once and for all that he was different.
Now, I don't know why God decided to put Abraham on this specific journey, through this specific uncharted territory. But I believe that the end of the story shows us this. God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he is going to do. And by sending a sacrifice to take Isaac's place, God proved himself to be just as good, loving, and faithful as he said. And he provided a picture of what he would eventually do for us on the cross with his son, Jesus. God would one day sacrifice his own son to take our place. That's how loving, good, and kind he is to us all.
And that's the way I want to view God, no matter what. You see, when Abraham chose to follow God's request into uncharted territory, Abraham allowed God to change the way he viewed him. And so can you. God can change the way you see him.
Remember the different views of God we talked about earlier? After hearing about the way that God interacted with Abraham and Isaac, are you willing to see God as more? Are you willing to believe that God may actually be all of the good things that he says he is, even when we can't understand what he's doing or how he's working? Are you open to the idea that God can change the way that you see him?
So maybe you are thinking, that's great and all for Abraham, but what does this weird story from the Bible have to do with me? More than you think. I think it teaches us to do two important things when it comes to seeing God. First, it teaches us to create room to be surprised by God. As you move through your days, resist the temptation to limit your view of God. Let him surprise you by revealing new things about himself, and give him credit when he does.
And secondly, it teaches us to look for God to show up. God may already be trying to reveal himself to you, but you're not seeing it. We're all naturally surrounded by so much noise and chaos that it's hard to hear or see much beyond of what's in front of us. My challenge to you is to look beyond the noise for the goodness of God in your life this week. Look for ways he's showing you his love. It could be through something amazing you see outside, or an encouraging word from a friend, or a verse you read in the Bible, or even a positive change in your circumstances.
God can change the way you see him. So this week, keep your eyes and your hearts open to that idea. And as you leave today, I want you to think about this question. What's one view I have about God?